What do we think ultimately happens to the workforce? Jack Dorsey at Square just announced that he was essentially cutting the company in half, and they were doing well, actually. And he's leaning into this. Now, I would recall that Elon Musk took over Twitter and laid off 80% of the workforce and didn't skip a beat. So maybe this is just Jack realizing, he needs to get more efficient. But it does seem to be a little bit of a canary, or at least people are treating it as a canary in the coal mine. What do you guys think happens to the work?
By the way, there was a counter study this week, which was interesting, and I think it was Indeed or one of these job posting things actually posted a study this week with a chart showing a relatively clear trend where software engineering jobs have been on a steady increase overall in the market. So, there's some kind of points and counterpoints. I think they're actually internally consistent with each other in that, I think there's a lot of jobs now to try to build these tools and make and drive these efficiencies and run these agents. And then can't get enough people to do those well. And there's a million more projects that people are willing to take on now because the cost of doing that project is lower. And back to the Jevons paradox conversation from earlier.
Right.
But but a lot of people have had a job doing things that the AI now does really well. Right. And so there's this retooling effort that has to happen. I think, and in the same organization, right? I think overall it may kind of come out okay, which is what has happened in past technological revolutions. But it was disruptive because, those jobs that aren't, that the AI can do really well, they're probably going to go away. And there's going to be this new class of job to do things we can't even imagine yet, or we would have, or in our head, we're like, why would you do that? That's way too expensive to try to do that for the value it would create. Well, if it's no longer expensive, maybe it's worth doing. And so it's worth having a job for. So I think that'll happen. I also think, by the way, all of our jobs are kind of stupid to people 150 years ago. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
I spent a bunch of years making video games, like, could you imagine someone's job was to like make pixels on the screen slightly more visually appealing than the other ones. So someone
how's that
can
guy
be
gonna
marginally
survive,
more
right?
entertained by it.
Yeah.
I think humans are really good at coming up with new ways to be competitive with each other, new ways to, do things that drive social status. I think things will wind up being created.
Right.
The basic things that keep us fed and sheltered and, all of the lower ends of Maslow's hierarchy will keep being driven more and more efficient.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we'll figure something out.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's undeniable. If you go one person at a time, everybody's got a story and it can be tragic. But if you come from the top down and you say, all right, the knowledge worker economy, let's say half of the knowledge workers out there lost their jobs because the work got reorganized, AI is doing part of it, half the knowledge work. That turns out to be about 10% of the population. And it's actually some of the more switched on, highly educated 10% of the population. So now you're telling me that a society where we don't have enough doctors, we don't have enough nurses, we don't have enough, of a million different teachers, right? We don't have enough really important jobs in society. You tell me we can't absorb 10% more into those fields? That seems crazy to me. Now, the switching costs are high and everybody has to make their individual decisions. And who am I to impose a million things like that? But from a macro perspective, the doomsday story just doesn't play.
Yeah, I think the doomsday story is it's slightly different, right? Intelligence work as it exists today, this exact way, is going to change, right? It's going to be disrupted. It's not going to be the same. If you are a traditional CPA who enters people's taxes, that might change because an AI can do that really well. It can understand the rules. It can figure out all of the different forms it needs to
The big,
fill out.
beautiful bill.
Yeah, it can do a lot of those things.
Right.
So that's going to change. But pivoting will have to happen. So it's all about the perspective on like the jobs as they exist exactly will change.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just like we weren't farming 150 years ago.
Yeah.
Just as Stu was talking about. A couple of things I'd just sort of throw into the mix. One is, if we're just talking about software developers, I think about Andre Karpathy, who you mentioned earlier, Stu, talked about how he felt like AGI was still 10 years away. And the work that needed to be done was a lot of scaffolding around it to get value from it in the short term. So I think there's going to be a ton of software engineer. And my guess is that's a lot of what that software engineer chart that you talked about is sort of driving. There's a ton of work, and we know because we do a lot of that work. Number one. Number two, I could see companies sort of almost using this as a forcing function, not unlike what Klarna did probably maybe last year, where they just said, "All right, we're just going
The
to move
pioneer.
all our support to AI," and then and a little while later, like, "Oh, not a great idea. We need to we need to sort of dial that back." So I could see some folks sort of pushing the envelope there, and I suspect that's some of what's maybe going on in a couple of companies. I agree. There is going to be disruption. I don't think anybody's saying there's not going to be disruption. And I think part of the outcome of that disruption, I think, will likely be the fact that creating and starting a company now has probably decreased in cost by an order of magnitude. So I would be willing to bet that you're going to see an explosion in the entrepreneurial class in this country and in the world for that reason. The 10% of the folks, Mike, that you mentioned that got maybe laid off, well, now they got a 6-month runway, which
Mhm.
in the past, wow, 6 months might not feel like a lot of time to get something up and running and build a product. But guess what? You can be in market like
Yeah.
inside of weeks.
Right.
And then the hard work begins in terms of marketing and getting customers and so on, which may be even harder because if there's so many things.
Create differentiated value that you can sustain, right? That's
Right? And so I think and then the final thing is, look, there are humans involved in all this stuff, and we don't like change generally. We sort of go a little bit slowly, and if you especially if you're running a big company, you gotta bring people with you, right? And so I think there's gonna be some element, some governor on all this change. It's just the nature of change and how to bring everybody along.